Welcome back, everyone, to the 706 podcast. It's been a while. It is a beautiful summer afternoon in the tri-state area. Traffic is light over the Verrazano Bridge. Today, we are taking another trip to Japan, to the land of the rising sun, for another cut from the godlike blade of Akira Kurosawa, my favorite director. You all know him. I've presented 3 movies. This is the third. I presented films of Akira Kurosawa for this podcast, this time with Kagemusha, 1980. And I would like to first introduce my co-hosts. 3 samurai lead 3 clans that vie for control of this war-stricken land. I'd like to introduce Anthony, who I would compare most to Ieyasu Tokugawa, the cunning and crafty sort of politician who would ultimately win the war. And then I would also like to introduce Tony.
Hey, guys.
Who I would compare to Oda Nobunaga, who was driven only by passion and ambition, and is sort of an aesthete, driven also by this love of art and meaning. And then I would also like to introduce Kirk.
I thoroughly enjoyed Tom Cruise in this movie. Not as good as Top Gun 2, but The Last Samurai, 8.5 out of 10.
Thank you, Kirk. Kirk, I would compare to our main character of the film, Takeda Shingen, sort of your classic samurai known for being steadfast, sort of traditional in a way. But of course, he has this sort of depth to him as well that we get to see, although mostly, of course, the movie is not about Takeda Shingen, but rather about his double. So the premise is this, before we get into reactions. Essentially, we are following Takeda Shingen, who is sort of losing a war, sort of at the end of the Civil War. He's about to be defeated by the 2 other samurai lords who will then themselves fight, and Tokugawa will win. But anyway, Takeda Shingen is trying to find another replacement sort of political decoy, this kind of decoy figure that he can, employ on the battlefield that will protect him. So like literally like an impersonator, essentially. His brother has previously been working in this capacity, but then they find this thief, this kind of low down random thief who just happens to exactly resemble Takeda Shingen. And the story is really all about how he's pressed into the service of this clan. He's made to impersonate Takeda Shingen. Eventually Shingen dies unexpectedly, but he has this kind of dying wish that to sort of for the security of the clan, they'll pretend that he's still alive until 3 years have passed. And so our main character, our impersonator, the Kagemusha, which means basically just the double, literally means shadow warrior, but sort of this, kind of battlefield decoy is the idea. At first he's forced to do it. Eventually he comes around to basically kind of embraces his task of impersonating the Lord. And then finally he's cast out, and he actually is not allowed to do it after 3 years have elapsed, but he kind of chooses, he regrets that, and he wishes he could. So it's kind of this about face that he at first is forced to, but then willingly wants to impersonate this Lord. So curious guys, of course I have a lot to say about this movie. Like Hidden Fortress, like you, Jimbo, I've thought a lot about this movie and I have a lot to say about it, but I want to avoid being too just kind of spilling my guts about everything I've thought about this movie. And there's a lot, of course, to think about. There's sort of like this kind of identity theme and sort of the theme of acting, that feels pretty rich and juicy. I hope we can talk about, but first I just want to get kind of gut level, visceral reactions to the film, a level of enjoyment, a level of interest, and level of, did it seem interesting to you? I think no one has seen it, right? Okay, so let's get the fresh reactions. Let's start with Ieyasu Tokugawa himself. Let's start with Anthony.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you for the great, thoughtful comparisons to each character. I would not have been able to do that, let alone remember the names. So I think, going into this, I've always felt kind of bad with Kurosawa in a certain sense, because the movies I tended to like, which certainly, he has a huge range of classics, or at least films people consider essential to the canon of world cinema, world film, have tended to be the ones, though, that are kind of almost steeped in the West, or at least Western ideas or things. Throne of Blood, inspired by, Macbeth, or Ron, with King Lear, or his film noir one. I think it was Stray Dogs. I can't quite remember the name at the moment. Seemed to be the ones I gravitated towards. Whereas when you showed us the first time, Hidden Fortress, yes, it's a huge influence on the Western film, but it just didn't really work for me at the time. And I haven't seen it since, to be honest. So I don't know, maybe if it connect with me now. Yojimbo, if I remember right, I had similar difficulty too. And I think part of it is, if there's ever an argument to be made for a film that needs to be watched on the big screen, Kurosawa would definitely be a kind of case A example. Because when I watched this film, when it was on my TV, everything just felt too small for it. And everything felt like I needed to be swallowed by it in a way that was impossible for me to fully get into, being on my couch and having a kind of smaller screen to kind of look at, which isn't a fault of the movie, but a fault of my own, viewing experience. It's a shame, there's bright colors, these huge orchestrated sets that feel like an IMAX screen would even be small. You do lose something of the power there, which is something I have to kind of give myself a fault for. At the same time, watching this movie, and there's just so much going on, I think one of the many ways that I could access it is to think about the sort of doppelganger question that runs through it, the Shadow Warrior, Kagemusha, which has sort of relevancy, to maybe like when we talked even about the double, but here it just seems so much more different. It's a very interesting kind of philosophical thing, I think, that runs through the movie, at least up into his reveal. And I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase this in my own words, and I'm probably failing, but in a way I kept thinking about this like Borges story, about this like Spanish literary critic who loves like Cervantes and Don Quixote so much that he actually just recreates Don Quixote line for line. And the question becomes, which book is more authentic to the experience? And I bring that up because here, what Shinjin is more relevant to this experience of war? And is the Shinjin that we eventually get any hint of the real Shinjin beforehand, let alone the Shinjin of a battle, the Shinjin of a nation, culture, and experience, which have a lot of really fascinating, I think, resonances. At the same time, a lot of these fascinating resonances are more fun in my mind than when I sometimes watch it on the screen play out. And I think part of that is, once again, having to deal with this in my living room as opposed to the cinema or the screen, where when I see the two women, serving tea and having laugh when they take it as a joke, when he admits that he's not the real general, it feels slow. It feels distant. It feels kind of like, I'm trying to give myself and not quite able to. So there's all sorts of things going on. At the other end of the day, though, this is like a very beautiful movie. It's a beautiful experience. That dream sequence, which has kind of like surreal Alice in Wonderland type tones, is absolutely breathtaking and wonderful. And it actually comes at a moment in the film that reignites my interest to keep going in a way that I think recommits me. So I think overall, there's a lot of things I liked, and I like this one more than Yojimbo and Hidden Fortress in terms of the podcast, but it still leaves me sort of behind in where I see Rashomon, Ron, or The Throne of Blood, the few other Kurosawas I've seen. But I'm looking forward to hearing what Connor and the other two have to say about some of the other big moments I didn't allude to.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think tickles the brain. I think we can say that. It has something to intrigue. But would it be more on the level of like you enjoyed watching Throne of Blood more, or like you thought there's more kind of meat on the bone even in those, that like ultimately you thought about the mimicry thing, you played with it a little bit, but it didn't seem to like be that deep, as opposed to those where the themes are more better explored, is what you would say.
Meat on the bone is an interesting thing. I wouldn't necessarily say there might be, in the sense that maybe because of the source material being so ingrained in our like popular consciousness, just kind of Western cultural traditions, maybe I gravitate towards being able to pull more out. Whereas this one, it's a little less, to me, in there, that I feel like, I am a bit more lost at times. I do feel a little bit more culturally distant, and I'm watching it like I am reading a history textbook at times, which may be the best way to put it. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's less or more meat. It's just different.
Definitely. And this is the only movie that really like treads like really historical ground. These are all like real figures, exaggerated, and he plays with the history, but you are kind of like reading a story that's been told a lot, which is like the end of this civil war. And I think even for audiences at the time, it's one reason why it's not as well regarded, because it feels like it's kind of retreading old ground. But thanks, Anthony. Let's hear from Tony next.
All right. As I watched this film, I was reminded of a quote from Marcus Aurelius. In short, know this: human lives are brief and trivial. Yesterday, a blob of semen, tomorrow, embalming fluid, ash. To pass through this brief life as nature demands, to give it up without complaint. And that's my review. 3 stars out of 5. See you guys next week. No, it's hard to say because the first half hour of the movie, I was really struggling to like just follow what was going on. Like I was literally like, who's who, what's going on, where are these guys going? And I was just like, God damn it, there's 3 hours of this. This isn't gonna go well. I literally paused the movie and like read the first paragraph of the Wikipedia plot summary to make sure I hadn't missed something. Cause I'm like, wait a minute, what is, and then I hadn't really missed that much. I'm like, okay. And at that point on, once things kind of settle in and the plot really gets going, it was pretty straightforward. But yeah, I mean, I had some similar thoughts to Anthony. I mean, I think that as it developed, it kind of opened itself up to me and I found more richness in it. Although I loved the opening with that like 5-minute opening scene that's just the static shot. I think that's really cool because this is a movie with, fireworks in it. This is a movie with real bravura, really virtuosic filmmaking, very showy stuff in terms of the color, in terms of the battle scenes and so on. And I think to open your film with just a static shot of 3 characters talking is, I think, a very confident move in a way, in terms of holding your audience's attention. And also just like, I love the purity and the simplicity of that. But very early on, we see just how visually incredible this movie is. There's that shot of the soldiers marching past the sun and the silhouettes. And it's just like, it just keeps coming. I mean, that dream sequence Anthony mentioned was amazing. That's one of those moments where you feel like he's channeling something, whenever a filmmaker is like, it doesn't just feel like they're copying other movies. It feels like they're channeling something real, like they're channeling like a genuine terror and a genuine dread. And to see that depicted in such an interesting way and to see it so colorful too is so cool because it's almost like a horror sequence, but it has these incredible like psychedelic colors. And it's just very, very, very cool. And I almost wish that he had I guess the movie, I haven't seen the movie Dreams. I guess it has more of that kind of thing, but I'm like, I want to see him do like a whole movie like this. Like I want to see him do it in that style. It reminded me a lot of Ron and, similar era in his career, similar like length, scale in terms of the epic feeling, visually kind of similar. And just that Technicolor, like incredibly bright, incredibly flashy visuals are just great. And I love the battle scenes, just the scale of them and the way he'll have something small happening in the background. Like there's this one shot where you see these like battering rams or these like siege engines with fire on them. And you see them for like a split second in the background. And then you see them in the foreground of the next scene. And I think that's so cool that like he took the time to put that, like think about how much effort that would have taken to cue that up and get it going perfectly. And just for that little background detail, which really sells the reality of this world. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much I can really go on here because there's a lot to talk about. I'd say in general, like I liked it quite a bit. I thought that the ideas in it were interesting. And I basically saw it as I kind of alluded to earlier as kind of a metaphor for just life itself and mortality. Basically, you're given this gift of life and what you do with it is your business, but sooner or later it all ends the same way. You're going to end up bleeding out in a river somewhere. And also the fact that he's rescued from the gallows, he didn't get to live this life. He was given this opportunity to have this life. And I think that the thief character is interesting because it's, again, he rejects it at first. And then he comes and begs them like, please let me do this. Give me a chance to play this role and to serve Shingen. And throughout, it's kind of interesting to see how his attitude towards his role and like what he's supposed to do with it. And you can see I kind of expected the way it would play out as he would gradually grow like more confident. Cause I don't know the story. I don't know the history at all. I thought he was going to grow increasingly like confident in his role and start to like make real decisions. And there'd be this whole thing of like, who can say he's not really him? Maybe he'd kill off all the people that know he's a fake. I thought that's kind of where it might go. But he does seem like almost ambivalent or not sure how to use the power. And you see like he has this real connection with the grandson, for example, who does believe he's his grandfather. And it's very sad that they have to, you can tell he wants to go back. He just wants to see the little boy one last time. And they're like, no, it's over. You're gone. I like too that it doesn't even make it the 3 years, because it's just a stupid thing with the horse. The horse kicks him off and the mistresses see that he lacks the scar on his back. So he doesn't even get his full 3 years, which I think furthers, the metaphor of like, you don't know, there's no set amount of time, and you never know what's going to happen. But found him an appealing character in the sense of he feels almost like an audience stand-in, or sort of his terror, his confusion is ours as we, deal with what we have to deal with. And I love the scene too, where they're at they're talking military strategy in that room. And the son, the passed over son who really wants to who's really eager, he's full of piss and vinegar, and he's eager to prove himself on the battlefield because his father never really trusted him with that level of responsibility and passed him over. And he just says, the mountain doesn't move. So he shuts him down, and he plays it perfectly. And I thought that was great. And I also like Shingen's character, much like Kirk on the podcast, is always absent. He's always off screen, and he's a lingering presence that we have to acknowledge. And we've learned about him through others and their reactions and their comments. But no, I liked the son and the brother, and how they are themselves kind of trapped in their kind of roles, and they are very much defined by the Lord and their relationship to him. So really everybody is kind of in the same boat here. Everyone's kind of playing a role. Everyone's kind of trapped. Everyone kind of is just limited to what the options that are before them, even though the people we're watching are in fact, powerful people. But in general, I would say I was very positive.
Very nice. Thank you. And I really like your reading. I never honestly thought of that directly as it is kind of about, it could be seen as really a metaphor that life of Thief is a human life, right? And what we see transpire in the film was kind of a metaphor for one human life. Is actually cool. I'd never thought of that. That's really cool. And I would just say to the thing of you mentioned the scale of the battles, and I love those too. In fact, that's my least favorite part of it. I like it because it's a way of setting off in contrast my favorite parts, which are all the parts where he's first gets to the palace and he's trying to enter his role. I love those parts. Those kind of smaller human moments are my favorite bits, but we can talk about that as we go on. But I think it's important that there's both elements. But let's hear from the mountain himself, Kirk.
Okay, well, interesting film, interesting choice. I have quite a number of thoughts about the film, and I found myself agreeing with Anthony and with Tony at different times throughout their takes. I think the thing that strikes me the most is that I just really don't find myself aligned with the choice of pacing in the film. I think it's quite poorly paced. It's almost akin to listening to a podcast at 0.5 speed, because every line comes out about 2 seconds later than it should. And that is probably 95%. I'm sure that's a cultural decision, culturally informed. So I don't want to sound like a xenophobe and say that, it's too slow. I mean, it's too slow for my Western sensibilities. I also don't necessarily like movies that it kind of feels like they set you up a little bit, where, we had this the text splashes in the beginning that are saying, describing the politics, the socio-political circumstances of this feud. And it's not really truly explore. I got the impression that we were going to go to Kyoto, and I got the impression that we were going to see a large battle. And, speaking of the battle scenes, I mean, it's like watching Aragorn charge, I don't know, Helm's Deep. And then it cuts to somebody holding up a picture of the cover of the Lord of the Rings Return of the King Xbox video game. Because it's we see Kagemusha, or we see, I don't know what I guess his name is Kagemusha. That's what it said in the credits. We see his reaction. This movie was made in 1980, okay? This movie was not made in 1947. We can see some horses falling down. We can see some people being shot and falling off their horse. We don't ever see any real battles. And I know that's consequential of the fact that they're using firearms more than they are using melee weapons, hand-to-hand combat. Maybe I was preconditioned. I was primed for some really cool, juicy battle sequences. I think the scale of preparing for battle is really cool. Probably one of the most kind of harried and frenetic sequences is when there's like these series of retreats and charges and retreats in the dark. It's interesting, but I wish we could see a little bit more of the actual fighting. Maybe that's also just kind of like I presupposed that this movie was going to play out a certain way. And the pace ties into kind of the central thesis of the film, which is like the idea of ghosts dictating the future. For me, this movie's strength and its weakness is that it is so heavily influenced by a character who dies in the first 30 minutes of the film. So we see the clan trying to carry out his wishes, and we don't get to see how he interacts much further beyond the first quarter of the movie. And it's kind of tough in that sense, because it's not like his wishes can change. It's not like, to me, I didn't get a sufficient foundation laid in order to be able to really appreciate the nuance of like his wishes, what they were motivated by. I know he didn't want the clan to die. I didn't necessarily understand why the clan would fail without him sitting on his chair. I mean, I guess he was a brilliant military mind. And here's the most intriguing question to me is like, was there ever a real Shingen? Like, so there's the Shingen that we see, there's the Shingen that everybody around him builds him up to be, and then there's the double. And I guess the fourth would be his brother as another double. But maybe in real life, the Shingen wasn't so, mountainous, right? Maybe he was more cowardly. And I think that's intriguing. I think the real kind of way I connected with the film was, for instance, towards the latter part when we see the double, we see the thief kind of on the battlefield. And it is like this ghostly visage of the now deceased warlord. And that's pretty cool, I think, because it's like he's watching the implications of his death play out. And I think that is really cool. Like the idea that appearance can be so powerful so as to instill confidence in somebody who was just this petty thief and now can be a mountain, and now can, even though, like you said, Tony, there's ambivalence throughout, but I think they did try to convey that he filled the boots of the role, you know what I mean? Like a little bit. And at the same time, appearances are very fragile, and you see the aides turn on him once the secret's out. They say, get out of here, and they start throwing rocks and mud at him. So I think his story is the most intriguing. That's what I'll say. That dynamic is obviously, to me, the most intriguing. I know, Connor, you're talking about like when he's adjusting to his role. That's part of it for me. Interesting, Connor, interesting film. And also, I just want to hear what I might agree totally with what you have to present. So
The mountain does not move. We are back in the 7 to 6 podcast studio. We had a little technical difficulty. Kirk had just finished his exegesis and review, or sort of capsule review, initial impression of the film. And I just want to say, reply to some of Kirk's comments and concerns and readings, is to say that, I appreciate you, Kirk. Like, Kirk said it was kind of like, it was dragging. The tone was kind of slow. It was disappointing, certainly at the ending, kind of how that battle plays out. And I just want to thank Kirk for nevertheless, like, really like tucking into the themes of this movie and having a lot to say about it. And I think everyone has had a lot to say about it. I just want to address to that. I feel the same way, Kirk, honestly, about like the one thing I don't really like about this movie. I like it like on paper, but I don't really like how it plays out, is that very ending, because then with this battle sequence. So, and again, let me address something too while I'm at that. When I said that this is like the only movie by Kurosawa that's like historical, I mean, there may be others that have some historical elements. So this just takes place right in the Civil War were real, historical events. This battle of Nagashino, the final battle that happens here, these three lords are real, right? And it's true that Shingen was defeated by the combination of Nobunaga and Ieyasu, and then they fought, and that's kind of the more famous part of the war. So it kind of ends before we get to the kind of what's considered kind of the really good part. But I think, right, what drew him to this particular story, why he, introduced this character, this fictional character of the double, in the case of Shingen, is that, right, it ends with this battle where a ton of samurai charge into basically just a barrage of bullets, just like this endless stream of musket fire, and they all die. And the way this is shown in the film is that, like, we just see them charging. We don't see them actually getting hit. The camera just moves back to the next wave. We see the guns firing over and over again. In fact, literally there's shots where it's just like, he'll play the same, like, 1 second clip, like, just over again. It's like very monotonous seeming, very kind of boring. You're like, okay, I get it. Of course, it cuts at the very end. Then we see the battlefield full of devastation, and basically there's a bunch of horses writhing on the ground. And right, they're supposed to have pathos, right? It's supposed to be this moment. And, as you mentioned, Kirk Last Samurai, right, thematizes the same thing. And there's lots of other Japanese movies too that do this, right? This idea of, like, the samurai being this thing of the past, it's charging into the future that it can't win against. It's impossible to win, the kind of fatedness of this, like, succumbing to the modern world, right? And that's exactly what that is. And I think that's what kind of attracted Kurosawa to this scenario. But of course, really, this kind of double thing, being the double of some lord, being this kind of commoner who suddenly has to take the place of a lord. It could be any story, it could be any place, any time, and that's definitely a Kurosawa kind of trademark, to have this kind of, yes, very Japanese specific in the way it's presented and, like, the cultural details, but the story feels like it could take place anywhere in a way. And I just want to say, just as we get to, like, my kind of want to have just a little bit opening spiel about, like, how I think about this movie, why I like this movie. I just want to say that everyone, you're right, kind of got to the thing that I think is really cool about this movie. And it is that kind of that juicy premise, right, of the double, right, of this person who's being forced to impersonate, right? He's from kind of the lower class. Again, as we saw in other Kurosawa movies, there's this, like, very strong divide between the kind of so-called, some people would call them, like, the low mimetic and the high mimetic characters. So there's the kind of the commoners and the nobles, right? And our thief character is a complete, commoner. And he really, like, sort of makes this contrast, as elegant, or as it kind of distills it down into its essence, right? In that we see from the very beginning, that very verse, that kind of cold opening shot before the credits, where we see Shingen, his brother, and the thief. All of them are dressed exactly alike. Shingen's in the middle. His brother is off to the side, slightly below him. The thief is off to the other side, below. And then we see another character who, while he has the exact same face as Shingen and is the same actor, Tatsuya Nadai, he looks different because he's sitting in a different posture, and he's sitting in this kind of carefree way, or kind of grumpy, has this grumpy look on his face, right? Eventually, like, the way he moves is completely different, right? They're sitting calmly. He begins to get upset. He yells at them. He's kind of losing his cool, right? It's very clear, like, who has the power. There's this immediate kind of, like, intuition of who has the power, right, in this, like, relationship. And that, I think, is kind of, like, central. As we see him go on, right, this character, the thief, right, has to kind of inhabit the role of this samurai character at first, right? And as Kirk was saying, he's pointing out that, there's this idea that really, in this, like, feudal society, what really matters is you have this kind of figurehead. Not many people are going to see this guy up close ever. So really, at first, it's just his physical appearance on the battlefield, which his brother was good enough to do. He has the same facial hair, wears the same armor, whatever. Like, no, it doesn't matter. He can manage to convince all the soldiers that he's there. That becomes very important in the one sequence you alluded to, Kirk, with the battle at night, right? Basically, what wins them the battle is that they try to sneak attack the son character who's gone out and tried to attack Ieyasu's army, or his fort, or whatever that he's taken. And they try to, like, counterattack, sneak attack them around the back. Then they realize that, oh my God, Shingen is there and he's still alive. And then they run away. I think partially out of surprise, and also that, yeah, Shingen's supposed to be this great general. Of course, basically all that the thief has to do, the Kagemusha has to do, is just sit there, right? That's all he has to do. And so you realize that, right, these people, right, do not have that much, like, political importance. They're kind of figureheads, right? And certainly their appearance, the appearance that they just seem to exist, is enough, right? And certainly that's the case too. And we see that that's not just true. That's not just something that's true of the thief character once he takes over the role. It's also true, I think, of Shingen himself, though clearly he's, made his way to the top somehow. We see that even he's not quite as, like, important as we might think. And I love this scene very early on. We've seen him. He seems like this incredibly imposing figure. Certainly in the first scene. Then we see him later. He's retreated to his, like, castle. and he's sort of hiding on. He's getting very frustrated about this like vassal of his that's run away and like not has like fled away from the army. Then this general comes, this kind of grandpa character, who's like his advisor, and he actually scolds him in this kind of cranky grandpa way. He makes even a cranky grandpa noise. And this unbelievable, like very like much like cuts through this kind of all this pretense, right? And so even he's kind of a figurehead. Like his advisors play a huge role in this kind of council of elders, like seems to have kind of all the power in this clan. And in fact, when they have the clan meeting, it's just, it's kind of just a show, right? That he is just supposed to say, yes, that sounds good. Let's do that. Thank you, gentlemen, and walk out, right? So, but he kind of asserts his personality within that. So anyway, so it's like, I think it's already reflecting on that idea. However, it goes a little bit beyond that because there's certain levels of security here, where at first it's okay that he can just appear to the army, but then he also has to fool a certain level of people within the actual like clan, including like the top like military people, except for that one council of elders who know he's fake, and also some few of his attendants. And I find this part really, really interesting, that you would think he thinks he has to come in and kind of pretend to be this refined lord. And he actually puts on this, at first he puts on this kind of imposing visage, right? We see his body change as he tries to imitate what his idea of authority is, right? Which is an imposing kind of almost, angry, disapproving, head straight back. And what they point out to him is that, well, no, like he doesn't have to act like that. Like he was very straightforward. That's what shows he was the Lord, that he would just slouch in his chair. It's everyone else, really, people who are in the middle of the society, people who have to make their way up the totem pole, so to speak, who have to act in this kind of artificial way. But at the very top, you don't really have to. In fact, they act a little bit like the thief does in the beginning. They act in a natural way. And that's kind of like a contrast that's made, physically. Like we see that physically with the characters in the movie, like with the lords at the top, they're kind of more idiosyncratic. Then there's all of the attendants who behave in this very almost robotic way, except for it being punctuated at moments, but they sometimes let their guard down. And then there's this kind of the rogue class of characters who are kind of always like the spies. We see the spies who work for the other clans, for instance, are these similar characters to the thief. They're kind of clambering around on rocks, and they sit down in a sort of natural way on rocks and stuff. And they're unstudied in their movements, which is contrasted with like these other figures. So I find that really interesting. And so basically what it makes is a sort of parallelism between the very top of the hierarchy and the lowest part of the hierarchy. And anyway, just to get to, sort of what I find is like really moving, and I think combines a little bit of all of what you said. There's this part where he is trying to put on a show for the attendants to show that like he can fool the people in the castle, for instance, that he can fool the mistresses, he can fool, well, he's already fooled the grandson. So there's this wonderful moment, and it's my favorite kind of scene of like acting in a movie or like acting thematized within a movie. It's when at first, right, they're asking him to like, don't act like that. Like look really weird. Like don't move naturally. You have to act like the Lord. And so at first he says, he sits up and like looks kind of angry, and they kind of say, that's not how he would act either. That's way too artificial. And then he says, okay, how's this? And in this like miraculous moment, he kind of slowly, just through this kind of tiny gesture, kind of transforms into Shingen by just imitating this gesture that he's seen him do before. You don't even notice that he's taken notice of this gesture, but it's so powerful that immediately all of the attendants, at first they started to relax in his presence because they thought of him as an inferior. Suddenly, kind of involuntarily, because he seems to have kind of become the Lord again, they sit up again. They sit on their knees out of respect, right? And they kind of start to see him as their leader or as their former, boss or whatever, or just, and then the detail that I find so crushing about the scene is that then the two attendants in the back, or the page boys or whatever, they start crying, and I think that kind of combines a little bit what we all said. I think what Tony said, for instance, about this idea of like the fleetingness of life, I would take it a little bit and combine it with what Kirk said and what Anthony, I think, too, said, this idea of like impermanence. The fact that it was so easy, basically, that he could go away, this person who was everything to you and defined your entire life can just disappear. It can be replaced by this guy that certainly doesn't fill the role. He looks the same, but he certainly is not the same man. But that just by altering his behavior, just through appearances and just through this detail of this human gesture, just through his kind of expression of himself, which can be faked, he can kind of replace that person. And it kind of shows you that, like, what are we? Like, what are we as human beings? That's all we are, right? It's this kind of series of gestures. I could be simulated, right? And it wouldn't really matter. No one would miss me, right? If you just simulated me, right, it wouldn't matter. So I think that's a theme, and it's a grand old theme in Japanese like culture. It's kind of Buddhist as well, this idea of like impermanence, this idea of the fleetingness of life and that kind of thing. And, and also a very Buddhist theme to the kind of the theme of like simulation, or that life is a dream. And this is sort of thematized at the very end with Oda Nobunaga, who unexpectedly like starts reciting a Noah play when he hears that Shingen is dead. And so that's how I kind of see it. I have other sort of thoughts to go with that, but that's kind of, I think, is the central theme, right? This kind of impermanence theme, the kind of replaceability of identity, the kind of the superficiality of identity, and also too the kind of the way that like the social hierarchy kind of breaks down when you look at it, right? That it seems almost that the sort of the level of pretense, right, the level of artificiality increases in the middle, right, but kind of less so at the top. But then there's a deeper kind of artificiality, which is artificiality of the natural, right, of pretending to be even that, sort of natural self can be simulated, right, and just pretended, right, at a certainly much less so at a higher level. And I think that's, again, it's kind of getting at like a film idea, that film is the thing that can show us that kind of higher level of artificial naturalism, right, which we know from film. And I think like Kurosawa is interesting because he's known for not being a naturalist in film for the most part, right? He's kind of comes of age in the 40s. We've talked about this a lot. And I think, I was hoping Kirk would kind of bring us to this topic. The idea of like, it's kind of hard to get used to the kind of acting we see either in like 40s movies or like Japanese movies. And certainly the movies that I've shown you, Kirk, obviously there's many like movies that are, like naturalistic from Japan. But certainly Kurosawa style is less the naturalistic style, but it's kind of that like, it's kind of cool to me that within this non-naturalistic style, this kind of more stylized theatrical style, we see the naturalism kind of emerge in this very marked way. Or if you see what I'm saying, it kind of sets it off. It kind of calls attention to itself because we see it happen. And I think, again, it's thematized in the sense that all of the characters, I think, like in terms of in the world itself, they feel like they have to be acting all the time, right? They have to pretend, they have to follow this decorum. There's this kind of tea ceremony-esque, kind of ethos to the way the clan operates, right? That's punctuated by moments of humanity, but even those can be simulated and imitated. Anyways, that's what I'm getting at. But curious if anyone wants to jump in. Any thoughts on those like themes or any other ideas that come to mind?
I'm curious, tying that. I'm trying to tie that in somehow with the allusion to the missionaries and the presence of religion and new religion in Japan. And I think it's it's an empire, or at this point, what is it? It's a collection of clans. I don't know what you would call it, but they're trying to determine their identity. They're in the stages of kind of prepubescence, and they're still growing and figuring out what this is. But they know they want it. They know they want, there's these actors that are very ambitious. And I'm just curious where that intersects, this crumbling facade that you mentioned, and you see the Nobukado, is that his name? The brother, and you see very vulnerable moments. I think one of the most poignant little scenes in the film is when he's discussing how he feels like his brother's shadow, and how the shadow can't exist without the actual person. And so there is this vulnerability that perhaps has nothing to do with these grander themes, but I'm trying to connect them. The crucifixion, the idea that he was on to be forced to be conscripted into this role play. It's almost a certain type of crucifixion. Perhaps he's laying himself down because Shingen wished for this to happen. It was part of his will, and it's to placate or to appease, to protect the people. So he's kind of doing that. He's sacrificing himself. but still, I'm interested, I guess, if I can morph that into like what you thought the prominence was, whomever one of you three thought the prominence was of the religious kind of artifacts or insinuations throughout the film, at least Judeo-Christian insinuations.
Yeah, Kirk. I mean, I haven't quite cracked this idea. Like, he's crucified at the beginning, clearly, right? That like he's going to be crucified. So clearly, which was like a way of, typical kind of execution in Japan, but there's no accident. He has kind of like a Jesus-like beard and stuff. And definitely there's something here. And there's this idea too, maybe of like, I guess where it connects to Jesus' idea of the kind of deputy of God, right? That Jesus is kind of a replacement for all of mankind or for God. He represents God, right? He kind of isn't, he's sort of like at a point of remove, like a reference to or echo of, but he's not God himself, right? That kind of thing. Like he kind of occupies a kind of middle role. And yeah, I get the idea too of like sacrifice. I mean, I think about why he seems to, and that's a little mysterious. Why does he seem to like re-embrace, he seems to beg, to be taken back as the double. I think about that moment where when he does that, it's when he comes to that realization, there's a bunch of these other spies who look kind of like him, or they move like him, at least dress like him, in his kind of natural dress, who appear in that cabin, seeing the corpse of Shingen being buried. Remember, before that happens, the thief is eventually he's sneaking around inside of the castle and he finds what he thinks is treasure and tries to take it, but he ends up coming face to face with Shingen's dead body. And I think you could interpret it as like, I think a pretty easy way of reading that, maybe not on a so like philosophical level, but just like on a plot level, is like he's confronted with the fact that he didn't know Shingen was actually dead. He never told anyone. He's confronted with the fact that this guy who looked exactly like him is dead. And that's kind of creepy. He's also forced to confront the fact that like the guy who saved his life, technically, the guy who had the power to prevent him from being executed, is dead. So does that mean like he's dead? And maybe it's like his fear of death, But also I think too, it becomes clear, like, especially as it goes on, like the fact that he wants to inhabit like the place of Shingen certainly becomes the case. And I think we can very much understand it when he starts to get kicked out and he develops this relationship. He's developed a relationship with the grandson. It's like it gives him a sense of belonging, like his life has meaning now, right? Even though he's not free to do whatever he wants, certainly not. He's less free than he was before, I guess, in a way. His life had way more meaning, and he got to step into the role of this, like, grandpa. He could have been this hero, right? Obviously, it kind of makes sense that he would want to return to that, but that's not really to the idea of religion. And you mentioned the idea of like the Jesuit priests that we see. So Oda Nobunaga has these like Jesuit priests who like bless him in Latin before he goes to battle. And at the end, he says like, Amen, as if it's like a war cry, which to me, I would read that a little bit, not kind of like as a central like Christian theme, but rather that like Nobunaga as his character seems to be like really fascinated with the West. And he like drinks the European wine that looks like blood. And he wears like conquistador's armor at the end. I love this detail, which seems to kind of go along with the fact that he and Ieyasu use this like muskets at the end. Like it's kind of connected, that it's like Nobunaga is someone who's like chasing like the modernity and the future, right? Even though he doesn't really understand what Christianity is about, he thinks it's like a cool, like they're giving him special powers when he's fighting, So he doesn't really get what it's about, but it just looks really cool. That's his kind of aesthete, kind of style. He likes all things, new, Japanese, whatever it is. And that's, to me, kind of is part of his representation as being the guy who embraces the future or, the outside world with the new, right? Whereas Tokugawa, who famously is the guy who will introduce, he was going to win the war, and his dynasty will basically implement the policy of isolation. So where they'll not accept influences from the Western world or whatever. So he's definitely against that. But he's willing to use muskets at the Battle of Nagashino. And then Shingen, I think, represents kind of like the old school samurai. Like he's totally not interested in the West at all, not even for fighting purposes or like muskets or technology. In fact, like his main style and is the thing that he kind of seems to be, or his strategy seems to be basically to stay within his own borders. He never like, the idea is that he never wants to leave his borders. And the only time that he does, he gets shot. But anyway.
Tony, I'm curious, or anybody, I guess, of the effect that we Anthony brought it up, or I think you did, like the the significance of color. And like, I'm curious what, maybe just struck me as something that Tony might have had something to,
like a thematic, like aesthetic kind of fusion, or like what's the resonance of the color,
or even what does Kurosawa wish for us to gain from it, in a meta sense. But maybe that's too far. It's just, I guess it's another tool for the toolbox, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a really pithy, like, well, clearly Kurosawa had watched Equinox Flower by Ozu and saw how he used color. And no, I mean, I think part of it is just the kind of I think Kurosawa likes spectacle. I think Kurosawa likes showing off. I think he likes, going in for these big battle sequences and really using color. And I think Connor said this last time when he pitched the movie that, like, most of Kurosawa's films are in black and white. So when he used color, it was like kind of almost like, it was like a kid with a new toy. It was almost like he got to really go nuts with it. And I think that it is very effective. In particular, I think with the redness of the blood, for example, is very vivid and really makes it stand out. And I think that's kind of important. I think the dream sequence too would not be nearly as cool or effective in black and white. I think that's like almost like that sequence alone kind of justifies shooting the film in color. And I just love the color palette in this movie. I love the deep reds, and that nighttime fight scene is so cool. I don't know if there aren't a lot of movies that have come out since this movie that I think really have the same aesthetic. I think that this and Ron are pretty unique movies visually. And I think, it's pretty cool what he was able to do. So I don't really have a super deep answer for it, but I think it kind of justifies itself just aesthetically. I was interested though in what Connor said about the whole idea of Shingen as the mountain, and the mountain doesn't move and he stays within his borders. And that's the extent of the strategy. And there's there's like a cultural component to that, where he's very traditional and he does things the way they've always been done. But that kind of connects him to the thief as well, of course, where it's like he has this prescribed role, and it's not really his place to question it. Or, I mean, perhaps he could, but that's just not who he is. So it's kind of interesting to see the different characters and their attitudes towards their kind of social standing and what they do with it or don't do with it. And like the son, again, is another example. What is his name? Shobiyaru or something?
Katsuyori, the
Katsuyori, yes. His son, who has been passed over as well, where he is kind of defy his role. He wants to push further, push past the borders and do more things, even when it's he's told by everyone. And I think Kurosawa would agree that it's not a good idea.
Yeah, let me go back to what Connor was saying in his initial summary, and then his points about artificiality, and then when Kirk brought up the religious aspect with I'm going to butcher this name, is it Nobunaga, who has that missionary scene. I think to get to Connor's point about the film wanting to tackle the question, right, of what is authenticity to an individual, or who and what makes the individual, which seems so simple. But on the other hand, I think the film presents one culture, which, in the most general, probably overly general sense, which is a Japanese culture, in which the most authentic sense of a person seems to come in heightened expression. The no play, the fact that people wear masks, not to cover themselves, but to actually give away of what they're supposed to be indicating. The fact is that there's all sorts of different masks in these kind of plays. But to go back to then the Western influence here of Nobunaga with the religious senses, we bring in Christianity, and once again, we have another kind of layer of gesture, ritual, and I think routines that then complicate once again what it means to be a person. And I think Nobunaga is kind of aware, even if it's historically true, I think as a film sense, there's something symbolically interesting about that. That Christianity is a religion of doubling and tripling. Jesus isn't just Jesus, but the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Water becomes wine, wine becomes blood. Everything seems to multiply to the point that you're not left with anything of the actual self unless it's tied to all sorts of other things. And I think Nobunaga, not just as a symbol of kind of modernity, is a symbol of how much we lose ourselves in the kind of traditions, rituals that we inherit or fall into, seemingly without, any ability to dictate. Everything seems fated, ordained. The thief, we never get a presentation of the thief. He's only ever the shadow of someone else. And by the time he's not the shadow, when he's supposed to be duplicating him, there's a question of artificiality at all times. But at the same time, we have to remember, as to many of these people, that artificiality is just as real as the real Shinjin, until, of course, the battle itself. War seems to be the one authentic ritual, one authentic action that really shows who a person is. And only because, of course, it brings them to the brink of death, if not death itself. So I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of smart ideas, Connor. I'm still trying to wrestle with some of them, but that's just kind of spur of the thought from what Kirk was saying as well.
I think it's impossible too for any of them to escape those traditions too, because even in the case of the son, where he's trying to push back against his father, the only reason he's doing that is because he's not supposed to, on some level, because he has this chip on his shoulder. So there's really no way out for any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting to the other, like, another element to this, like, reading, and I think Anthony mentioned, right, the fact of tradition. And I would say that, just as a side thing, I mean, I think in battle, that also is a place where, representation matters, where the figurehead can matter. In the case of the battle in the middle, the night battle, right? Because his mere presence alone is enough to scare the people away, right? But you're right that also this is the place where everything kind of comes to a head. But I think another thing we're thinking about, kind of we're talking about again, and I kind of alluded to this with the whole, like, the fact that it's the Battle of Nagashima, the fact we have kind of not only, like, sort of East versus West, we also have this kind of, like, past versus future, kind of theme. And I think that's something that's definitely part of this equation, that we're kind of seeing this idea of kind of, like, right, this traditional Japanese society. I mean, it's kind of in chaos at this particular period of time, but is recognizable. These institutions, these customs, the idea of the samurai, right, that lasts a very long time and still influences, and right, Japan kind of sees itself as this kind of unchanging place, right? Or certainly did. And of course, in the case of World War II, there was a literal attempt to forcibly kind of, like, reclaim the past, right? In the sort of fascist ideology that Kurosawa, would have grown up with. Not that he embraced, he was being critical of it. But he's definitely dealing with that. He's definitely thinking about that. And I think in some ways, how I would like to think about it sometimes is that Shingen, who is the mountain, this kind of stable force, not completely, but mostly he's kind of seen as this iconically stable force, and he's the most traditional of the samurai, of the daimyos, the feudal lords. He kind of seems to represent kind of the past, and the past is stable. The past, you know what it is. It doesn't move, right? It stays still. Whereas we in the present, the present is constantly shifting, and the future is, of course, unknowable and ever shifting. And to me, I think in kind of like a metaphorical way, the relationship between Shingen and the thief is kind of like a relationship between the past and the present, or that, like, we kind of looking back on the past. And to me, like, I think of this in terms of, like, my own, like, studies. Like, I look back on kind of like big figures like Cicero or Caesar or whatever, and I kind of look back on those characters who seem to be, like, incredibly grandiose, kind of inhuman, figures to me. They have some aspects of them that are human, like I can kind of see myself in them in a way, but they seem kind of also evil, in a very different way than I am evil, or, I'm sort of a mere mortal myself, but they, responsible for so much more death and destruction. Yet I have this kind of fascination with them. And I look to the past as this place of, like, stability, that's a refuge from the present. And somehow it gives me, like, meaning. But I think the movie kind of presents that as a kind of like a fatal thing, and kind of a bad idea ultimately, because it's kind of a sad fact of life that this happens, right? That kind of thief character kind of wants to find himself in the past, wants to aspire to this kind of almost this historical figure, I would almost think of him as, even though he's exists in the same time. He tries to inhabit him. He can't quite be him. He can't quite live up to it. But he's willing to kind of die just in the name of this person who really, as we established at the very beginning, is no better than he is. In fact, he's a worse person. At the very first scene, he says, the thief points out, like, you call me a scoundrel. You're a bigger scoundrel than I am. I took a few coins. You've killed thousands of people. You've robbed whole domains, and you call me a scoundrel. And he's like, it's true what you say. I am evil as you believe. I am wicked as you believe. I am a scoundrel. He says that very matter of fact. He's like, I like this guy. Like, you're telling the truth. You're right. I am a scoundrel. And so he's even a worse person. And so there's something kind of sad about that, but also kind of tragically human about that. And that's kind of where I go with some of those ideas of tradition. But that's putting just my little spin on it. That's kind of my like reading I find very compelling about this from this movie. I think it's backed up by the idea of like the theme of Nobunaga being like kind of being interested in the West, and that kind of represents modernity, and also certainly in the case of like the guns thing would be like a pretty big thing in that reading, right? The idea of the guns representing right the future, and then also the fact that, you know, when the thief character dies at the end, he gets shot. He pointlessly charges into battle and gets shot, and then he flops face down in the water, right, which we also see in his dream, where Shingen is first he's standing still and he kind of, this thief chases after him. Sorry, Shingen chases after him and he runs away. Then the thief chases after Shingen. Shingen runs away. And at the end, he's standing in this pool of water and splashing around, and the water representing kind of impermanence, unknowability, right? The future, the ever shifting sands of time or whatever. And that to me is kind of what that seems to come down on, this kind of surrender to the future in a way. Not sure exactly what that means, but I just find it cool to think about. I think it's artistically done, kind of very clearly like drawn themes, if not, and juicy and interesting to think about, if not necessarily, completely straight out in my mind. But
and I think too, there might be a meta aspect to that too, as you know, Kirk points out, oh, this wasn't made in 1947, but it's like, you know, that is when, you know, as Connor said, that's when he came of age. You know, Kurosawa at this point in his career, it's later in his career, he is kind of a filmmaker of the past. He kind of represents an older style of cinema. And I'm sure he's aware of, like, you know, kind of the changing tides and new Hollywood and all these other things going on. I'm not as knowledgeable about what precisely was going on in Japan cinema at this particular moment. You know, the up and comers he would be trying to put down, the pretenders to the throne. But I'm sure that was probably on his mind when he made this movie. It's just his own age and his own, you know, where he is in his career.
Yeah, people would have been watching. People would have loved, like, Taxi Driver. That would have been like the coolest movie, like, for that generation of filmmakers coming up then, right? And certainly frenetic, kind of new Hollywood type stuff was cool then, and certainly like this movie was a throwback, which I'm sure he kind of used for marketing purposes as well. Like the grand old master is back, but
yeah. And I was reading that. I'm sure you guys saw this depending on where you watched this, but in the credits, Francis Ford Coppola, and George Lucas are listed as producers. I think that's their title, helping out with the budget for this movie when it ran through its Japanese budget, securing it international distribution. So not only is he an elder statesman, he's a worldwide icon at this point. This is worldwide, the representative face of Japanese cinema, outside of, I don't know, maybe Ozu, who I don't know when he passed away.
He just passed him a check that just said, for the Hidden Fortress. Lucas did, that is, to acknowledge that he ripped him off. And that Star Wars is 100% based on Hidden Fortress. But okay, guys, I'm not sure, because of our little break, how much time has elapsed. Well, I was wondering if we should move to the voting. Why don't we do it in the usual order, or rather the order that we established at the beginning? Let's go for, I believe it was Ieyasu Tokugawa. That's you, Anthony.
All right. Okay, final thoughts, Connor. I liked your overall interpretation. I feel like it's like a lengthy, or in need of a lengthy sort of treatise, a sort of 60-page little monograph. But I think one final thought, though, I will add, is the sort of other condition of the movie. We talked a lot about fate and artificiality, but the more simplistic, perhaps modern contribution here is also just the indifference of the state, indifference of governmentality to all these people's lives, which I think runs through in a way that feels to them natural, but is itself a kind of unnatural force, like a Greek god or Greek, kind of figure. But finally, let's see. I think in a weird way, I think seeing this one and comparing it to the other Connor Kurosawas, this one ranks in the middle. It's above Hidden Fortress. It's below Yojimbo, which just had a bit more of that kind of visceral excitement. I don't know. I liked hearing the discussion of it still a bit more, which I hate, using, but I'm going to have to say soft no. Understood.
Guys, Tokugawa has spoken. That's totally fair enough. How about Tony?
Yeah, I sort of feel that way as well. I like Yojimbo's. I like just the simplicity of Yojimbo, and I think Yojimbo is the one, like, to show somebody who's never seen a Kurosawa movie, I feel like that's like the perfect one. But this movie is also so different and has so much more kind of going on. I think it's kind of a richer text, as we've kind of teased out a little bit. I love the dream sequence. I love kind of all the, as we always say, the meat on its bone, the different kind of meat, the different colored meat, you might say. I'm gonna give it a yes. I think it deserves a spot.
Yes. Well, thank you, Tony. Well, that brings it all down to Kirk, who appropriately enough we have dubbed the Mountain. He is Shingen. He is this kind of figure who will decide what happens. Where will he fall? But Kirk, be honest, okay? No, don't try to pull some Kirks. I can feel a Kirk coming on.
It's interesting. I'm intrigued. This power is intoxicating. Boy, one little piece that I always try to think about. This film is like a dual displacement because it's not only culturally disorienting, but chronologically as well, or temporally, I guess. So I like to think of the link being just Japanese culture in general, and how would somebody in our cohort view this movie who was raised in Japan, is steeped in Japanese culture, and that's something I like to think of, is, and I'm curious about some of the reactions. It just, for me, it just provides a greater appreciation for the level of nuance on display. The idea that this movie is from a progressive voice and perhaps a rather repressed and conservative in general society. And so that is just an extra layer there. It's kind of interesting to me. But I think my favorite part of the film is just those super saturated shades of pink and fuchsia, and I love those. So visually speaking, and I also, like I said before, I do like the kind of the allegorical meat, the penis meat of the what do you call them? Body double, the double, yeah. So I think it's probably my least favorite Kurosawa that I've seen, but I would still have to put it in the top 706, even, and that doesn't necessarily make sense because I voted no on Hidden Fortress. But I think this is a movie that if I came back to it in 20 years, I would be like, yes, this has stood the test of time. This is a really, really solid foundation, really gorgeous. The writing is clever but understated. The acting is superb, and it's quite haunting at times, even with its faults, which I think the pacing is one of its key faults. But I'll say yes.
Well, Kirk, you got it in. We have another Kurosawa in the 706, but I feel it was somehow it was a Pyrrhic victory because I don't know. I mean, I didn't feel, this movie because of the way I approached it too. I mean, I approached it in a very well. Like, I'd been thinking about this movie for a long time. I kind of had a spiel prepared. I kind of sort of gave my spiel, and I'm glad I gave my spiel for the record, for future generations to understand this film. But anyway, thank you guys for engaging my Kurosawa fandom and putting up with my spiel. Now we move on to the fan favorite segment, which is the part where you guys suggest a movie and I get to choose which one we want to watch. Now, remember, we're operating under the Kirk protocol, which means that you have to choose, each movie has to be from a different decade. But now another part of the selection process is deciding who will have the privilege to go last, generally. So who has gone least recently?
I believe it's Kirk.
I believe it is Kirk. So Kirk, what do you have to say?
I'd prefer to go last, actually, even though that might be a hindrance. So I'll have Tony go first.
All right.
Tony.
I'm going to go I'm inspired by Connor having a third Kurosawa movie. I think that there's a handful of filmmakers that warrants having a third episode. I think it's time for a third Scorsese episode. And I'm going to go with Casino, I think. 1990s Casino. I just watched Goodfellas and I love Goodfellas and I would do oh, you watched it too? I watched like the day before Ray Liotta died, not even just coincidentally, but I feel like Casino gets a little bit passed over. I feel like in recent years I hear more about it, but I feel like it gets so overshadowed by Goodfellas. And I just love watching this movie. 3-hour runtime that absolutely flies by, deals in some similar themes to Kagemusha, guys. You'd be surprised, but it kind of does actually. Very brutal movie. One of his most horrifying in certain ways, but also very funny. It's a great movie, and I think it's definitely worth a podcasting on. It's crying for an episode, so let's do Casino.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess that means Anthony goes next.
Yes. So Tony's movies from the 90s. Let's see. I think inspired by Kagemusha, inspired by Casino. I got to go the opposite route. I'm going to go stripped down, minimal 90-minute movie. And I still think it's been a long time since we did an action movie. So I'm going to nominate 1978's The Driver by Walter Hill. It is a kind of stripped down film, essentially just about a driver who works as a getaway driver for a group of people, featuring, just great car chases, great scenes, great action, stripped down, no dialogue, hardly any. Bruce Dern in this kind of interesting, demented cop type role. There's not much plot to really discuss. It's a kind of simple, visceral level, and I think we haven't done that in a while. I'd compare it most similarly to like The Raid Redemption or something. It's cool. 1978, yeah.
1978, more of an actioner, interesting pendant, let's hear it from Kirk.
This is tough. So let me just clarify. So 70s and 90s. Okay. Yeah, that gives me some options. I think I'm gonna go No Country for Old Men. It seems kind of like a throwaway at first glance, but it's actually a movie I think we could get a lot of mileage out of, and it just feels appropriate after we're just ensconced in this Eastern kind of atmosphere, and then we just move complete opposite, right? Halfway around the world, and we're really invested in the Western kind of motifs and themes that are presented. You have Tommy Lee Jones as this aging sheriff, really great. The voiceover is amazing. Javier Bardem is haunting and monolithic in this role. I mean, we all, I'm sure, have seen this movie. Probably, I would be surprised if any of us have seen it fewer than 2 times. And it deserved to win what it did, but there are some controversial decisions. What's coming up in my head is the ending for sure. And yeah, I don't know how many of the Coen brothers we've done. I mean, we haven't certainly jumped in to their catalog, to their filmography, but I think this is a worthy choice. I do. So, there's some other good options here as well, but interested to hear rebuttals.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that goes to our second round now of rebuttals. You've heard the other people's recommendations. Make a case for why yours is the one we should watch and why I shouldn't want to watch the other ones. Don't hold back. Tony.
No Country for Old Men. More like Yes State for. Okay, never mind. I'm not gonna. That would be a good one to do as well. I need to rewatch. I've seen it a couple times. It was actually the first R-rated movie I saw in the theater, because it won Best Picture that year. And my mom's like, I'll take you to see No Country for Old Men. When I was I would have been 13 or so, I think, or 14, I guess. So no, that would definitely be a good one to do as well. Coen brothers, very rich filmography. They have a lot of great choices. And that, I think, is one that kind of sticks out among their films. It feels like kind of a unique film in their discography and one of their most notable, not just because it won the Oscar. So I would be eager to, and there's certainly a lot to talk about with it. So I'd be eager to do that one. The Driver, I have not seen. Have you pitched it before, Anthony? It sounds vaguely familiar.
I don't know. I think last time I did a
Getaway
McQueen movie. I don't think I've
you
done
pitched
this one. I think I've
Bullet and The Getaway. So I think this is like your little wheelhouse. I got them all confused. Okay, so that one sounds cool. I just know nothing about it, so I can't really comment on it either way. I guess I would say, just to going from, I think it's different from Kagemusha while still having some kind of similarities, and it's kind of interesting to see kind of the potential influence and seeing kind of like different takes on this theme of like the passage of time and like the passing of the guard, and also like institutions, like the institution of the mafia and how the mafia adjusts to changing times and how it intersects with, you know, American capitalism and all these things. I think it's a pretty rich film. And I think it's just a really fun movie to watch. I think it fits our podcast. Can I say that it's like way better than the other two, or they're way more worth doing? Not really, but I think it would be a very solid pick, and I think we'd all enjoy it and have something to say about it.
Interesting. I think I'd be more excited to do Kirk's, which I've only seen once actually, and I actually like the idea of going back to their filmography and going from a comedy. I think we did Serious Man last time, so going to their dramatic side and one of their better ones, I think at that is interesting. It's been a long time since I've seen it. For Tony's, you know, you've heard my spiel before. I've always preferred the spiritual side of his work to the gangster or action side. Although I go back and forth with how I overall feel about that movie, so I don't know. I think Walter Hill's The Driver. It comes from a place, late 70s, kind of a king, a great kind of B film that really transcends that label. It's a hugely influential one. And of course, it's been remade, most famously by Refn, and Drive is kind of one of the keystones for that. Baby Driver. They all, of course, just use the word drive in their titles. But, you know, we're huge names for this. This is Walter Hill, of course, a major kind of action figure, a major touchstone for a number of other directors. He did not only this, he did 48 Hours, he did The Warriors. But The Driver, I'm not going to say there's a high philosophical value or high interpretive value to it. This is something that I think is just different. It's a kind of gut punch. It's an action punch, which is kind of maybe a change of tone from what we've done.
Okay. I didn't know. Yeah, I just drew that connection. Walter Hill. That's really appealing. I am a big Warriors fan. It was actually one I might have considered suggesting today, but I held off. You know, and I love Casino. It's, to me, criminally underrated compared to Goodfellas. I don't know why Goodfellas is so hyped. Maybe because it came I believe it came first, and yeah, it's more like within the line. It probably following in the footsteps of movies like The Godfather. I think that's probably why Casino feels a little more displaced. But you know, Sharon Stone, she gives the best performance, one of the best performances in a Scorsese film that I've ever seen. I feel like I've seen most of them. So yeah, that'd be a good one to do. Certainly my favorite of that genre of like narrator who's also a criminal, and you know, Wolf of Wall Street, Donnie Brasco, Goodfellas. But I like No Country for Old Men here. I like the environmental storytelling is really, really on point in this film. I can appreciate just, there's so many little pieces in this film that are, even to the way like the glass breaks in one of the gunfights. I think it's just really made with a lot of care. Not saying the others aren't, the other two aren't, but yeah, it's just a really kind of soul touching film for a variety of reasons. It feels so like artistically imbued, but at the same time somewhat gritty and raw and unrefined, kind of like the West, right? Like those kind of tropes we've meddled with throughout our viewings, including that Western we watched that I can't recall the name of, but that would be
Once Upon a Time in the West.
Once Upon a Time in the West. Yeah, there's some familiar ideas there, like trying to civilize what we deem to be savagery, and you know, how the Mexican influence plays into it. Certainly racial connotations there, of course. But yeah, that's my pitch.
Good, everyone. Good. Well, that leaves me to pick. No Country for Old Men. Okay, seems like the obvious, the big one, the big cheese. But I have to say it's my least favorite of the Coen brothers, perhaps because, as Tony said, it's so different from the rest. You know, it doesn't have that comedic. I mean, sure, maybe a little bit, but like, There's a very just so completely different tone, adaptation of a novel. It feels very different. It's a completely different approach to dialogue. It's something about it's always kind of not sat right with me compared to like there are other movies that I love. Let's think. I mean, also one thing about we could say the same thing of Casino in terms of length, but not in terms of tone. Certainly, we just had Kagemusha, which is a pretty serious movie, kind of, some funny moments here and there. But anyway, pretty like heavy going, I would say. Casino is certainly more fun to watch moment to moment, still with some heavy themes. I guess the antidote to all that would be Drive, starring Ryan Gosling. We have the basis of this, which is Driver, starring Ryan Reynolds, I believe you said, Anthony, as a 3-year-old, maybe a 1 year. No, certainly he's probably younger than that. Anyway, so this intrigues me, and Anthony's been trying to get this kind of thing on these kind of 70s stylish, new Hollywood films that have anti-heroes that and this is like a really like important genre for me. I've always believed that. Yet, I think I'm actually going to pick No Country for Old Men because I think it deserves another shot. I was thinking to myself the other day, like, I have to watch that again. Like, significant. I've matured, I've grown. And I don't mind the idea that it's like, sometimes I think we shy away from, though, like it's one thing I love about the podcast is like we get the hidden gems, and I suggest Kagemusha, not Seven Samurai. I suggest, blah, blah, blah. You guys suggest things that are, you suggest Age of Innocence, right? For instance, like, so there's something like that's like of much value to that. But I think like as we're looking back on our catalog, we'll probably want to have some of like the big names, the big kind of tent pole movie guy movies. So I think it might be nice. And like I said, maybe tonally, it's going to be a little bit. We're going to have to talk about a lot of themes, that kind of thing. Maybe kind of scratching our heads and kind of thinking about what to say. But it's also a movie that like, you can also just talk about how, obviously it feels so unique. And, I remember you seeing it in the theater when I was 6 years old. I was actually given the privilege. No, I'm kidding. So I think it could be cool. I'm sorry for kind of baiting you there, Anthony, or getting your hopes up. That was a little cruel, but I think it's kind of.
I know how Kirk usually feels. So
yeah. That was a little tricky.
I'll watch Driver in your honor, Anthony. It sounds like a good movie.
It sounds very cool.
I just want to say, I think we can bring our own spin to it because it sounds like, well, first of all, Anthony, who knows how he might react after only one viewing. I know Tony will love it. I'm sure he'll have his own spin, but then Connor, you're coming in with a little hesitance or apprehension, and that's going to only make for a good episode. I don't think we're going to all just sit around and be like, bro, Javier Bardem was so lit in this film, bro.
Yeah,
that silent shoddy. I use that in COD. No,
that's honestly, I remember like thinking that at the time, like a video game of this would be so cool.
Wait, would you play as Javier Bardem or as Josh Brolin?
Plays both.
He plays both. Okay.
Yeah. GTA 5 style.
All right.
But thank you, Connor. Thank you for the vote of confidence, and I will prepare for what should be an interesting episode. I have some good questions already in the tube, and maybe Anthony, would you like to carry us home?
Please do.
Yeah, I guess I'll have what Kirk's having.